Tell me a little bit about, because I know you see a lot of photographs, and I know you've gone to Palm Springs
Right.
Photo Festival and evaluated people's
Right.
work. But
I do.
when someone sits in front of you
Mm-hmm.
and they're about to open their portfolio
Mm-hmm.
and say that they're saying they're specializing in street photography,
Mm-hmm.
what are you hoping to see when you open that portfolio?
Well, what I'm most hoping to see is something that will surprise me, that I've never seen before. And whether my initial reaction is, oh, that doesn't really work, or my reaction is, oh, well, here's a new idea that's really important. I want to see something I haven't seen before. Because the thing that I may at first have a kind of knee-jerk response to and say, I don't get it, uh, is, again, it's like that thing on the contact sheet you have to go back to. It may be an idea that needs to grow on me for a while. So I want to see the biggest variety, and especially a new variety of what's out there. And that's what will often focus my attention the most. If I see something I haven't seen before from a street photographer, or really from any photographer when I'm doing portfolio reviews, something I think that I may at first think, well, that's not a very fruitful line of development. Why are you doing that? I'll always try and talk to the photographer in the most constructive way I can, precisely because in the back of my mind is maybe I just don't get it yet. Maybe I need to have more context for this. So again, surprises, things that throw me a bit off balance, especially. I prize in seeing any new photography, but especially street photography, where people fly by unconscious instincts because of the nature of the situation in which they're working.
I can imagine people watching or listening to this are thinking, how can you surprise someone when you're photographing the ordinary? You
Yeah,
know?
yeah.
So can you give me an example of an image that you've seen recently or fairly recently that has that surprise factor, that, wow, you revealed the street and the world to me in a way that I haven't after all the thousands of pictures I've looked at before?
Uh, I can think of a photograph, a Robert Frank photograph, that I suddenly paid attention to. One he'd made many years ago, that I recently paid some attention to simply because it fit with other photographs I was trying to. At one point I realized that three very different photographers had made photographs of exactly the same subject, in a sense, which is a photograph of a situation in which someone has fallen in the street. So there's somebody lying down who's blacked out or been hit by a car or whatever. We may not know at first. One of the photographs is one that Robert Frank took back in the early 50s in Paris, I think probably it was. And the second one is one that Gary Winogrand took in Central Park in the 80s, I think it was, or maybe earlier, maybe the 70s or even 60s, where someone had fallen, and obviously he must have had a heart attack or he blacked out, and there's a knot of people there. And the third one is a piece by the photographer John Baldessari, who is essentially a postmodernist photographer who's recycling photographs from the past. And the picture I'm talking about, that at first I chose just because it was of the subject, that it was this picture of someone down in the street. And I looked at it and I thought, well, otherwise it's not a very distinguished Robert Frank picture because it was taken from a distance. I think he's up above the scene looking down on it. And Frank is like Winogrand, is more effective when he's a bit in the mix of what he's photographing, when he's out on the street himself rather than looking at a scene that's developing below him. And it's a scene where we see someone who's fallen. We see only his feet in the foreground. And then there's a crowd behind him. Like a lot of Frank's pictures, the light is quite flat. It's a rather overcast day, which is what he often prefers to shoot in. Except for the fact that we see on the edge of the picture that somebody's fallen down in the street, and that's probably why there's a little bit of a crowd there. It doesn't seem a very distinguished picture. But then actually in a conversation with Joel about this picture later, I think it was he pointed out to me that there's a wonderful touch in this photograph, which is that there's like a signboard man there. He's not wearing this. He's holding an advertisement. He's walking around Paris with an advertisement for Buñuel's movie Los Olvidados, The Lost Ones. And it's such, I mean, here's a picture of a man who's been lost in the crowd in the sense that he's fainted. And there's this advertisement for this movie, which is a kind of comment on it. That kind of coincidence is, of course, what street photography is all about. It suddenly made me realize it's actually a much better, more considered picture than I had at first thought it was, just that he, took this picture in this way. So there's an example with a much earlier picture where something, where it just seemed to me a boring picture, and then later I thought, no, there's something more going on there. And as I say, as I look at, I'll give you an example of some photography that at first I didn't quite know what to do with because of the scale of it. Is work by Nathan de Vere, who's a photographer, street photographer, working now in New York. And in his pictures, the group of pictures that I first saw, human beings were tiny and very far away. He was shooting from a great distance. There are people walking on the street. Sometimes there's a little bit of an incident going on. But I was put off by the distance that he was from the subject. I felt like, I like that muscularity of Cartier-Bresson and Winogrand and Meyerowitz being kind of in the mix of the crowd that they're photographing and seeing things close and far. And I couldn't quite get near de Vere's, but what I realized was that what he was interested in is the way that contemporary advertising, which puts these huge scrims of ads on the front of office buildings and other public buildings at street level. Used to be that stuff was on a billboard up on top of the building or out in the countryside somewhere. And now that kind of advertising photography has invaded the public space of street photography, the public space of the streets themselves. And de Vere was purposely trying to make pictures. I began to realize that the background was not as indifferent as I had first thought, but that in many of these pictures, he was playing off the very carefully posed and photographed figure in the ad against the unconscious casualness of the little tiny real people in the street, playing off the omnipresence of this manufactured visual environment against the real and spontaneous visual environment of the people on the street. And those photographs became more and more important to me as I thought of them as photographs that are a commentary on the condition of postmodernism. Not postmodernism as a theory and a kind of decentering of the history of photography, but what postmodernism points out about the ubiquity of the visual image, of the manufactured visual image, as the environment in which we all live, and something that influences the way we think about our lives because of its invasiveness. That here's a man who's making a comment about the relationship of spontaneous, unintentional realities to manipulative realities in the same visual form. They're both forms of photography. They're both very powerful, and the one diminishes the life of the other, shrinks it in a certain way. And here's a street photographer who's figured out how to comment on the postmodern condition in which we live. He's not making postmodernist photographs. He's making street photographs in the traditional sense, but he's commenting on what we've learned from postmodernism, rather than just giving in and saying, well, I can only and only recycle somebody else's imagery.
One of the things I'm most excited about the last, 20 years is the advent of the internet and how it's opened up this practice of street photography to the world. Not only people who appreciate looking at it, but practitioners of it. I see some amazing photographs coming out from Asia, from South America.
Yeah.
Tell me about your experience of that and how you think it's going to influence what you're going to do with the subsequent edition of Bystanders.
Well, as I say, in the division of labor that Joel and I have always used, when we decided to do a new edition, I decided that, as you know, the book published in 1994. Then in 2001, because to our amazement, the hard copy actually sold quite well, they put out a paperback edition. Little Brown put out a paperback edition for which we did a new afterward. And I took the changes in the history of photography, I mentioned them, but I kind of keep them in the background. I don't really talk about postmodernism. I certainly don't try and analyze its effect on the history of photography at that point. And so my idea in the new book was that I was going to do that. So the division of labor, which was very much the original division of labor, was that he and I went and looked at pictures, the history of photography together when we were getting ready to do the first book. But he edited the pictures and often proposed to me. Sometimes I would say, gee, no, I want to use this picture too. But for the most part, they were pictures he chose while I was doing the kind of cultural, intellectual background research on the photographers and, you know, getting ready to try and write a credible narrative of this particular genre. So I'm working in the library and he's working with other photographers and with the copy prints we have and the, you know, the knowledge we've picked up from what we've looked at together, as well as a lot of stuff himself. For the new edition that we decided we were going to do and that Phaidon offered us the ability to do about 3 or 4 years ago, or a little more actually than that now, he has gone online and looked at thousands and thousands of pictures, at all of these things. We acknowledged the existence of In Public in 2001. It already existed as this kind of online forum for photographers. But now there's scads of them. Every street photographer who's serious about it, even if he considers it just an avocation or even a hobby, is out there with a website. So he went and looked at thousands of things, and then I looked at his take of that stuff. There were times when there were certain pictures that I wanted in the book that he was usually glad to accommodate me on, but that weren't in his cut. I wasn't just responding to that. For instance, to give you an example, Iwan Ban, who is an architectural photographer, basically, and his photographs of contemporary architecture are terrific, and often include figures, and often the figures, as in Nathan de Vere's, are very diminished. They're tiny. They're, sometimes architectural photographers like to have a person in the picture just for scale, to give people a sense of scale, but he's doing more than that. And I've often had this feeling about photography in general and street photography in particular, that it is a medium so powerful that sometimes it's approached most fruitfully by being approached obliquely. Somebody who had a different purpose than being a street photographer sometimes has a bit of a breakthrough or offers a new idea about how street photographs might work. And again, that happens because, as I say, it's so powerful. If you just take it head on, it's sometimes overwhelming, and the photographer's sort of numbed by it rather than stimulated. You know what I mean, what I'm talking about? So I like the fact that Iwan Ban was making pictures of the buildings, not the people. The people were included as part of the composition in a way that was stimulating precisely because it wasn't his primary purpose to do life on the street that architecture increasingly is, because more and more of it, the whole thing is glass. More and more buildings are being built in a way that everybody is as transparent when they're inside as they were when they were outside. That's one of this modern scrim advertising that goes over the thing, is a way to create some more privacy for offices that can see out but you can't see in. That's why that becomes a viable commercial space that you can rent to use as ads, because it works both ways. So anyway, again, the point is that we have this way of going back and forth in which he does the primary work in one regard, the visual regard, and I do the primary work in the intellectual regard, and then we mesh it. And the ultimate meshing of it, I mean, there are certain issues that always remain unresolved between us. And that dialectic, that was always the fact that we came from very different places when we started with this mutual interest. We like to leave some of it unresolved, and that's why, like the original book, this book will end with a conversation in which we talk about things and have differences of opinion and are excited about it all.
Let's talk a little about privacy. Privacy is a big issue now, but especially in the realm of street photography, where photographers are making photographs with people without their awareness, without their obvious permission. Can you talk about that with respect to the world today and how street photography plays a role with that consideration?
Sure. In fact, this is, of course, a legal issue, and I'm not a lawyer. I recently had an interesting experience of being commissioned by the ACLU to write an essay on the history of street photography so that they could defend some street photographers who were being hassled by the police here in Los Angeles. But basically in law, this issue has been settled recently in a precedent-setting way in New York State, where Philip Lorca de Corsia was sued by an Hasidic Jew that he had photographed. And again, he is very much part of the postmodernist aspect of street photography and how street photography has a postmodernist presence that's rather strange, because he was taking photographs of people where he couldn't even see the subject when he photographed them. He was across the street and he was triggering an automated camera from a remote access device. And the photographs tended to isolate the subject. Rather than embedding them in the crowd, it was isolating them from the crowd because a strobe fired and so forth. And this Hasidic Jew, who against whose religion it is to be photographed, sued him because he then published the photograph and made prints for sale in a gallery and so forth. And the case went to the Supreme Court of the state of New York with a decision written, as I recall, by the woman who was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the state of New York, and who said that even in this circumstance, anyone who is out in public is fair game for journalism in any form, and that if you're out in public, someone else can take your picture and publish it, and it's fair dues. Again, obviously, if you put something in an ad and use that person's image to sell your product or somebody else, that's a whole different thing. But taking the picture and showing it in a museum or publishing it in an art book or putting it online is absolutely legitimate. And so that's a precedent in law that's I think just less than 15 years old now, and so is an important one. And this situation that I mentioned here in Los Angeles that the ACLU asked me to help them with was an interesting one, because what the police were doing was hassling street photographers, occasionally even confiscating their files from their cameras, and other ways trying to intimidate them, but they never arrested them. And they didn't arrest them because they knew that if they did, they'd get murdered in court for doing it. So it was, again, it was a kind of the police making political and cultural policy rather than actually something whose legality was questionable. It's not questionable. You can photograph anything you want if you're in a public street and what you're photographing is in the street with you.
Let's hope it stays that way.
Yeah, right.
Well, my final question that I ask all my guests is that I ask them to suggest or recommend a photographer for the people who are my listeners typically, but people who are watching this video. I'd like you to suggest one photographer for them to discover and explore on their own. So it could be someone you've long admired or someone you've recently discovered, but who would that one photographer be and why? Yeah,
let me single out again Nathan DeVere, because I've just mentioned him. Because I think that he is writing his own sort of essay on postmodernism in his street photography. And this is something really new, the ability of the street photography to come out from under the kind of burden that the postmodernist point of view has put on them, the way that it has in some ways marginalized them. He's found a way to sneak back in to mainstream photography with an awareness of postmodernism that makes it part of the photograph, not something that's pushed the photograph off of center stage. So I think if there's one photographer I would say, look at this guy's work and don't at first be put off as I was by how small the people were. Think about why they are, because I think he's really making an original, very contemporary comment about photography and how it's emerging from the postmodernist era.
That's great. Well, again, I want to thank you for everything. It's a real honor for me to have a chance to sit down and talk with you and talk shop.
Okay. My
Thanks a lot.
pleasure.